About 500,000 school pupils have dropped out of school since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic in South Africa. This is the total number of dropouts in the country from the pre-pandemic number of 230,000. Now, poverty is listed as among the main reasons for the high rate of school dropouts. To discuss this in full, I'm now joined by Professor Reza Daniels, who is a Principal Investigator and Associate Professor at the University of Cape Town School of Economics. Prof, a pleasure to have you on the program this afternoon. Now, since the health risks posed by COVID-19 to children are much lower than the risks to adults, do you think that primary schools in particular should remain open during the pandemic to avoid this high rate of dropout of learners?
Thanks so much for having me, and especially on a topic as important as this. So the short answer to that question is yes. We think that all primary school children should be back at school. I think there's positive momentum to helping to see that happen. However, one of the things that have been found is that high school children aged 15 to 19 have a higher probability of becoming infected with COVID than primary school children. So the recommendation at this point is that high school children still have a degree of social distancing at school and of around about 1 meter. And if that cannot happen, then rotational timetabling may still need to be in place for high school children. But at the primary school level, there's a degree of confidence in the epidemiological community now that there is evidence that the learners are not transmitting COVID more rapidly, and most of the teachers are now vaccinated as well.
Now, this 500,000 number is astonishing, to say the least. Have we been able to determine the main cause for this high rate of learner dropouts?
So we don't know exactly. And one of the reasons is partly because of the transportation of school children to school during the pandemic. Because there's rotational timetable, the difficulty has been knowing who to pick up when and how and where. So the logistics have been complicated. But the truth is that we don't know for 100% certainty why that is. We do know that school dropout has tripled from about 230,000 pre-pandemic to approximately 750,000 in May 2021. So it's now at its highest rate in 20 years. And that is definitely a cause for concern. So all of the momentum now about getting learners back to school as well as educators is definitely something that needs to continue, and of course that's going to be correlated with vaccinations as well.
Now, Prof, I want us to look a bit deeper into the numbers. Just talk us through the pre-pandemic or normal rate of dropouts in schools compared to the numbers that we are seeing currently.
Thanks. And so you mentioned that when you started the interview that one of the main findings from some of the research based on the Newzroom survey, as well as additional research in Mpumalanga and other provinces which targeted specific schools, basically we were able to determine that there's roughly about 230,000 people who are learners dropping out of school pre-pandemic. And the difference is that that has increased threefold to about 750,000 learners in May 2021. So, of course, parents are also afraid of sending their kids to school. Logistics in terms of transport are tougher. And unfortunately, this not only impacts upon the amount of learning that takes place, specifically the amount of crystallized intelligence being built, which is the ability to retain new knowledge, but it also affects school feeding schemes. So many kids' main meal, especially in poor areas, their main meal during the day was at their schools. School feeding schemes in South Africa play an incredibly important role to learners, not only in terms of feeding them, but because of the fact that they're not hungry, their cognitive development is better. So in the absence of these kids going to school, not only have they been affected by learning losses, they've also been affected by much higher rates of child hunger.
Now, I'm glad you touched on the point of the concerns being raised by parents. Are we also finding that more and more parents are moving toward homeschooling their children amidst this ongoing pandemic?
Sure. So again, homeschooling is possible. So yes, we are seeing more homeschooling taking place, but homeschooling is possible for those who have the resources to do so. It's very, very difficult for poorer families. And one of the things that we're finding during this pandemic is that the traditional educational equalities and inequalities that have plagued our society have been exacerbated. In other words, they've gotten worse, right? So poorer learners are at more of a disadvantage to wealthier learners. And that's not just because of things like the increased ability to homeschool, but it's also because of the fact that kids at private schools very often have access to dual modes of teaching. They can either go into class and learn with a teacher, or alternatively, they can watch the classes online. So when poorer learners are restricted from access to those kinds of resources, then our educational inequality is worsened.
Now, a short while ago, you also explained to us the impact of this pandemic on students who rely on the school feeding scheme. Please expand on this sentiment for us.
Sure. So the school feeding schemes in South Africa have been one of the most important interventions in the post-apartheid era. And one of the reasons for that is at the early childhood development stage, nutrition is one of the key determinants of cognitive development of young children, and it's one of the key developments and one of the key contributors to schooling progression rates because of that increased cognitive development. We know we live in a very unequal society, so poorer kids are particularly gain disproportionately from that intervention. So when we don't have school feeding schemes, which we didn't have during the early stages of the pandemic when schools were shut, and we also had less of it while there's been rotational timetabling, we have found that the impact of those learning losses have been higher, and the nutritional losses have exacerbated, in other words, made worse those learning losses. So it's the worst of both worlds, unfortunately. And that's such a powerful reason why we want to push the idea that vaccines are getting educators back in the classroom and they're getting kids back to school, and therefore they should be increased in terms of the frequency of vaccines and the numbers per day.
Now, Prof, before I let you go, I just want to find out what are some of the reasons why the highest rates of dropout were found mainly amongst the poorer households and also rural areas.
Thanks. Again, this is something that we don't have causal explanations for. However, because of things like school transport being very complicated when you have rotational timetabling, may just have been something that's too complex a logistical organization to coordinate well. Particularly when we've gone from very high levels of lockdown, reduced those levels of lockdown, and then unfortunately had to go back. So as we moved back into the second wave of COVID-19 infections in late December and January 2021, we then moved out of that by March, but we've gone back to level 4 lockdown during the last month or two, and that's associated with the third wave of lockdown. Under these circumstances where regulations around what's safe and not are so uncertain, it's very likely that many kids and many parents have chosen just to keep their kids at home and try and do the best that they can. This is, again, just one of the reasons why we think it's so important now that we move to mass vaccinations so that rotational timetabling can end and more kids can be back at school.
And as we wrap up, what is the long-term impact for primary school learners who have lost about 70 to 100% of learning during this period?
So the long-term impact is definitely severe in the sense that you basically hit the nail on the head. Basically, kids have lost anywhere from 50% to 100% of learning, which means that they've basically at most missed an entire year, partly due to the difficulties. So the question is, how do we respond to this? Now, you've got some of the best educators in the country and on the planet trying to work this out, because it's not only been affected in South Africa, it's also occurred all over the world due to the lockdowns associated with trying to mitigate the impacts of COVID-19. So what we're seeing increasingly is that those with the means to do so can find alternatives, such as high schools that begin to focus more on module development and cognition before kids progress, and less on having to pass a single standard at one time, for example. But that's going to happen amongst schools that have these resources. The challenge for South Africa now is to make sure that even in our poorer communities, we've a revolution in education to try and find ways so that kids can learn in a way that facilitates their catch-up over time. And what we're going to have to do in order to facilitate that is make sure that the entire pipeline of education, from primary through to secondary and ultimately through to tertiary, now gets thought of as a much more incremental approach with a lot more different pathways towards getting kids through these different standards. And it's a great challenge, but I'm certain that we have the capacity in South Africa to rise to that challenge.
Well, Prof, thank you very much for your time. That was Reza Daniels, who's the Associate Professor at the UCT School of Economics and who's also a principal investigator in this study that has found that about 500,000 learners have dropped out of school since the outbreak of COVID-19. Now,